Okay, now what was your career path in your own mind at that time? Would you expect to go on after 1 year and do something else, or
Well, I
what?
would expect to go on to a residency in time, but just sitting around the interns' quarters during that year, there was a group of us who were pretty close friends. Actually, all of us from the Big Ten, and one of my best friends was a fellow named John Hill from Iowa, Cedar Falls, Iowa, to be exact. And he and I decided that we wanted to join the Navy. And then when we went in the Navy, asked to be seconded to the Marine Corps, because as you know, the Marine Corps has no medical corps, all Marine doctors are Navy doctors, and be sent to Vietnam, because the war in Vietnam was heating up at that time. So we did that. We went down, we enlisted. We talked to a very gnarly-faced chief petty officer in the officer enlistment office in Los Angeles, and said, we'd like to be Navy doctors, and we'd like to go to Vietnam with the Marines. And he looked at us and said, doctors, I don't think there's going to be any difficulty whatsoever in granting your wish. So off we went.
You might have been the first people to ever volunteer such an assignment.
I don't think so. I think there were more than us, but we were the two that day.
Okay, so then what?
I went to Vietnam and was a battalion surgeon for the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment.
Station?
We were south of Da Nang, and then we were north of Da Nang, between Da Nang and the demilitarized zone, and that was for a year. Every once in a while, we'd get on a Navy transport and go down, and because we were the ready amphibious group too, and do a landing someplace, and then jump out and go back. But we were basically around Da Nang.
And the guy from Cedar Falls was with you?
He was with another Marine battalion, but he was doing essentially the same thing.
Okay. All right. So then what? After a year, then what?
After a year, I got orders, which I could not understand. I had to take them to my commanding officer, a Marine colonel, and I said, what does this mean? Well, what it meant was I had orders to be assistant naval attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta, Indonesia. I would go back to the United States for, it wasn't very long, 6 weeks, and go to attaché school in D.C.
Washington, D.C., yeah.
And then off to Jakarta. And so I was off to Jakarta in 1966.
But you don't know how or why you got this kind of an assignment. You don't know where it came from.
No clue, other than the fact that in the Navy and in the Army and in the Air Force, one medical officer was assigned as an assistant attaché, not as the attaché, but as assistant attaché. That apparently was tradition. And the Air Force...
But they could have picked somebody else.
Yeah, they could have. They picked me.
There had to be a reason.
I'll be damned. I don't know why. I have no idea. But the Air Force guy was always in Moscow. The Army guy was either in Manila, the Philippines, or Delhi. And the Navy guy was always in Jakarta. So I was in Jakarta.
So what happened when you got to Jakarta?
A lot of things happened when I got to Jakarta.
Tell us a few stories.
Well, I can tell you a few stories because there was a revolution going on there. And there had been the attempt by the Soviet Union to essentially suborn Indonesia. And because the biggest thing is the seaways that come around Indonesia and then head up toward China and Japan, and they wanted to control those. And so there was a really, really good consortium of Americans, Brits, French, Germans, Australians, especially Australians, who were doing everything in the intelligence field to prevent this from happening. An attempted coup failed, and at that time, Suharto kind of started to move in and take over for Sukarno. So these were very, very interesting times, and I loved working with the officers from the other militaries and the intelligence services from other militaries. And of course, there was a very big KGB presence in Indonesia, and they were. I had to laugh because they were just like the KGB was portrayed in the movies. Oh, doctor, you would like Russian vodka? We'll have 2 or 3 vodkas. No, thanks very much. I think I won't. And the Polish had an embassy there. And of course, they were hand in glove with the Soviets at that time. And the East Germans did as well. The great story is the Polish military attaché, whose name was Władysław Milgrowski, had these 2 absolutely gorgeous daughters, who he kept trying to push off on Westerners, especially Americans and Australians. And I had to go to my commanding officer one time and say, look, Colonel Kellogg, not a Battle Creek Kellogg, but his name was Wilbur Kellogg, said, Colonel Kellogg, look, Colonel Mugrowski keeps kind of throwing his daughters at me in a way that I find a little bit questionable. And I just wanted to let you know that. And Kellogg looked at me and he said, don't worry about it. He said he does that to everybody. I said, all right, well, I feel better about it now. But it was great fun. I think the fun story, the most interesting story was I was in my office. We had a little dispensary in the embassy in there one morning, and the ambassador's office called. The ambassador was a man named Marshall Green, who was a true diplomat in every sense of the word. He was professional. He was married to a woman named Lispenard Crocker Green, who was a daughter of Edward Crocker, who was the American Charge d'Affaires in the embassy in Tokyo on December 7th, 1941. His boss, Ambassador Joseph Grew, was not there. So Edward Crocker, and he's in all the history books, this was his daughter who was Marshall Green's wife. But anyhow, Marshall Green's secretary called me and said, we have an American here who's doing some research on conserving certain things and trying to get the Indonesians to respect this national park called Ujung Kulon, which is out on the west end of Java, and all the flora and fauna there. And he hasn't had his gamma globulin shot yet. And that's what we gave for hepatitis then. You know, you've got gamma globulin, which is mixed globulin, which one hoped and did have some hepatitis antibodies in it. He said, would you come up and give this gentleman, unnamed, some gamma globulin? And I said, well, Mr. Ambassador, of course, I'll be right up. That was a big shot, Bill. That was about 8 cc's you pushed in. Wow. So I pulled it up and put it in a syringe and wrapped it in a towel, and I'm down the hallway and up the stairways to the ambassador's office, and I walk in, the secretary said, go right in, and the ambassador's there, and the other gentleman is there, and he has his back turned to me. And I said, okay, Mr. Ambassador, here I am. Is this the gentleman? And the ambassador turns to me and said, oh, yes. He said, Joe, I'd like you to meet Colonel Lindbergh.
Really? Are you kidding?
And
yeah.
I did a Whiskey Tango Foxtrot on that one, believe me. I said, okay, and I turned around, and it's Charles Lindbergh.
Wow.
So
wow.
I have the distinct honor of having pushed 8 cc's of gamma globulin into Charles Lindbergh's behind.
Whoa, and everything turned out all right.
Everything was fine.
Thank God.
Yes. But as you remember, toward the end of his life, he was in his 60s then.
Yeah.
He was interested in conservation.
Right.
And this is one of the things he did. He was in Indonesia, and he was looking at this area on the west side, left west end of the island of Java. So there he was, and there I was.
Wow, that was an incredible
But
story.
that was a great tour of duty.
Yeah.
Had the opportunity to work with wonderful, wonderful people.
What about Suharto and Sukarno? Did you actually have any personal meetings or experience with either of them?
I did. I met Sukarno several times. I can remember the first time I met him was the presidential palace, and there was some kind of a reception. And I was in uniform, and which we didn't do a lot of, but I did then. And he turned around and looked at me and said, who is this young man with the crew cut? So I had to introduce myself, and he spoke some English. It was fine, so I did meet Sukarno. Suharto was a little different. Suharto had been commanding officer of the Jakarta military garrison, and at the time of the coup that failed, he had called the Siliwangi division, Siliwangi Tiger is the Javan Tiger, commanded by a man named Irbam Aji, down to Jakarta to secure all the government buildings, and by doing so, the coup failed. And so I'd met him on several occasions.
He spoke English too?
No.
No one?
This
English.
was the thing. Another call from Ambassador Green said, Joe, and I said, yes, Mr. Ambassador. And he said, we would like you to go to Suharto's residence and teach him some English.
Whoa.
And I said, Mr. Ambassador, I said, I'm honored, but why me? He said, because you are the most junior and the most inoffensive person around here carrying a diplomatic passport, and we don't think anything could happen to you. You're so junior. So for about 6 weeks, I can't remember which day of the week it was, but one day of the week, maybe a Monday, I can't remember. I would drive to Suharto's house, and go in and walk around a table in the entryway and teach him English phrases like, where's the men's room? Good morning, good evening, how are you? That sort of stuff. And we did that for about 6 weeks, and then he felt like he'd had enough. He was a very pleasant guy.